We are going to get into bias. Let me give you a roadmap of where we're going. Very brief community agreements. We're going to talk about what bias is, and we're going to approach it from like a scientific neuroscience standpoint before we get into the lived experience standpoint of bias. We're going to talk about what's going on in your brain and other people's brains as they're experiencing bias. And we're going to talk about what I like to call lived realities. What's the lived experience in terms of how people are experiencing the impacts and effects of bias? I am an attorney by training, not by practice. I sprinted away from the practice of law as quickly as humanly possible. Graduating from law school and taking the bar exam. I have worked as a consultant in the anti-racism and oppression fields for about 5 years now. Prior to that, I worked at UCLA, where I went to law school. Doing diversity recruitment and outreach internationally. So I was out of the country most of the year for the better part of a decade and then jumped into this work. And the springboard was doing this sort of work at UCLA as kind of a launch pad, if you will. I did programming for students, I did programming for staff, and now here we are. I don't think I need to remind anybody what happened in 2020 that brought us all kind of full circle, both in terms of pandemic and career shifts. Just a couple of community agreements. I'm not big on rules. I am big on me being interrupted. I am incredibly neurodivergent. Interrupt me at will. I interrupt myself regularly. I'm totally fine with you doing it. Other than that, this is meant to be a dialogue, so just try not to interrupt anybody else other than me while they're speaking. And I'm being serious. I don't mind if you interrupt me and say, stop, I have a question, slow down. And also, this is meant to be a judgment-free space, right? We're engaging with the concept of bias here. We all exercise biased behavior from minute to minute on a regular basis. It's not the big boogeyman that it's made out to be, at least not most of the time. So if you see yourself leaning into judgment, please just check yourself. Ask, what's leading me to this space where I'm assuming something? What's the action that I'm now taking based on that assumption? Try to slow yourself down. And when we get into some of the science behind this, you'll see exactly why I'm asking you to slow down a little bit. A couple of bottom lines. You don't know what you don't know. Assume that your information is always incomplete, always. And as we get into this, we'll talk about it, but bias impacts everybody regardless of how intelligent they are, regardless of the role that they inhabit. Doesn't matter if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a judge, it doesn't matter. Bias reflects in professional experiences in the same way that it does in society at large. So if we know, for example, that 40% of people are making biased decisions on a regular basis, guess what? That means that 40% of doctors are making biased decisions on a regular basis. Assume you don't know a lot, right? That should always be our starting point. So I want you to ask yourself, what is tainting my viewpoint, right? Is it hierarchy? Is it privilege? Is it in-group favoritism? We see things as simple as, I grew up outside of Philly and people are obsessed with Eagles. Sports teams. People form significant attachments and in-groups and out-groups based on sports teams, literally. So little things. Do you have children and your colleague doesn't have children? Age, things that we don't think are that important, we form bias. And of course, always ask questions. My big ask before we jump into this is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. This work, whether it's bias, whether it's anything in the anti-racism and oppression realm, it's uncomfortable work. This is the work of burden shifting, burden sharing. Who has historically borne these burdens and how do we shift the burden? How do we carry more of what we haven't had to historically? Let's get into it. Subconscious. Okay, so there's a big piece of what's happening under the surface. And I know we said unaware of or aware of, but subconscious, that's huge, right? So we're gonna talk about the brain and what it's doing here. Let me give you a kind of clunky definition here, or idea of what's happening. Our brains are interpreting information that is coming in so efficiently, so well, and so below the level of our conscious awareness that we believe that what we are seeing is objective. We apply a veneer of objectivity to everything that is coming into our brains. We don't ask, is this accurate? Is it correct? Is it objective? Is it tainted by bias? We just take the information and we walk off with it, right? That's it. We rarely stop to ask questions. And that's where bias comes in. Now, a really simple definition of bias is anything that departs from neutrality. So positive and negative, large or small, it could be slight, anything that departs from neutrality is considered bias. And none of us are neutral ever, which gives us an idea of how we exist in terms of bias. So where does bias come from? How did we get here? How did we get to all of us having brains that are constantly operating within the realm of bias? Yeah, and you're describing a specific type of bias, which we will get into probably in our second session, but confirmation bias. We like to confirm the information that we already have. We love, as humans, to confirm what we already believe to be true. And we will ignore information that goes against the beliefs that we already have. We shore up our bias, if we will. We make it stronger, but on a more elemental level, on a deeper level, where does this come from? Like, why do we all, everybody in this room shares at least one thing, which is that we are biased. What you're describing is the process of heuristic. Heuristics are a mental shortcut, a mental path shortening, if you will, for survival. We are now exposed to more information than we ever have been before because of our smartphones, because of the 24-hour news cycle. And by information, I don't just mean like fully formed ideas or beliefs. I mean, we're receiving information right now, light, temperature, we're hearing voices, we're hearing, whatever it might be. Maybe you're hungry and your stomach's rumbling. That's information, but we're also bombarded constantly with additional information. Now, survival. To survive in non-safe situations, you need to push out some of that information. And our brains have become incredibly effective at doing that, at the risk of losing the ability to sift through. So what's happening is we're trying to survive. We're trying to make mental shortcuts to get from A to B more quickly. We're trying to repeat a path that has been ingrained in our brains, which is great most of the time. When it's not great is when bias comes in with respect to other people. And we'll talk about some of the ways that this pops up. So a little bit more on kind of where this comes from. This blue-green piece here, the amygdala. What is the amygdala? In our brains, on the basis of our amygdala. You said the bedrock of our accumulated emotional experiences. What's in that, right? The stuff that's in our brain isn't just like there. It's being sifted through something, and oftentimes it's how we're socialized. The majority of what we believe is a result of socialization from when we are yay big to now. We are absorbing things constantly, and our amygdala is attaching emotions, specific emotions, and cueing specific responses. So someone over here said fight or flight. We have this emotional coding part of the amygdala, but we also have the development of an appropriate, and we'll see why I'm air quoting in a second, fear response. That is happening in the amygdala. I want to jump backwards just a second here and talk about amount of information and speed of information processing. Scientists estimate, and I want to just put up here an asterisk, this varies from person to person, and we've seen large distinctions based in gender, which is really interesting in terms of how people are processing information, which also societal in terms of who is exposed to what on a daily basis. But the estimate across identity is that we are processing upwards of 11 million bits and pieces of information at any given time, like right now. 11 million, it's a lot. We hinted at what some of these things are. Temperature in the room. Are you hungry? What are you making for dinner? What do you need to do later? You might be having fully formed thoughts about something. Just stuff everywhere, all the time. Now, here's the kicker. We can only consciously process 40 of those bits and pieces of information. So what happens to the other 10 million? What happens to the rest of it? It just goes in there. It's going in, right? But it's not being processed. It's just not consciously being processed. So earlier, when subconscious, you're unconscious. What's happening is this path that we've created based on all of our other socializations, based on all of the other information we're taking in, is telling those 10 million plus other pieces of information exactly where to go. Just doing it below the level of our conscious recognition. This information is not only being processed, it's being processed incredibly quickly. What you see in front of you is a timeline of 1 second. 30 milliseconds is how quickly we typically process information that is coming to our brains that we are unconsciously filing away. 30 milliseconds. That's quicker than you can do most things. 525 milliseconds, about a half a second, about 17 to 18 times slower. That's the speed of conscious thought processing. So those 40 bits and pieces of information that we are processing, that's in that half a second range. All the other stuff, the 10 million plus other pieces, that's in the 30 millisecond range. That's a massive difference. This tells us two things. One, there's a distinction between how our brains function with respect to conscious and unconscious. And two, your brain in the background is dealing with unconscious information incredibly quickly in a way that is informing how you behave before you can even think about it. Heuristics, the process of shortening the path between thing A and thing B or thing A and thing C, right? That's why our brains do this. But what happens at the expense of speed, right? What do we lose? Because we are constantly moving this quickly. A couple more notes before we get into what's called amygdala hijack or the amygdala response. What exactly the amygdala is, and we've gotten at this a little bit, but it's a collection of cells at the base of the brain. There's actually two. It's where things are given meaning, remembered, right? Where emotions are attached. It's also, importantly, for the purposes of bias, where physiological responses that attach to these things start. What do I mean by physiological responses? What's our body doing when it's triggered in this way? Energized, agitated, tense. Our body is literally pumping epinephrine, cortisol, the things that our body does when it's fearful or worried or feeling trapped, feeling like we need to make a sudden decision. Our fight or flight response, or fight, flight, or freeze response, we stop thinking. Logical thought goes out of the window. And I want to hop back to our timeline here, because the other thing that happens is this 30 milliseconds shrinks. It becomes even quicker, a shorter span of time when we are confronted with something we are fearful of. Now, what are we thinking about right now when I'm saying something we're fearful of? When I think about the amygdala, particularly with respect to bias, I think about like lizard or caveman brain. This is the same brain that we had not all that long ago in terms of the human timeline, where we were roaming around in bands of 40 people or fewer, right? And so when something approached, it was, is it dinner or my dinner? How does my body need to respond appropriately? And this is how we got here, right? But most of us are not catching dinner on a daily basis, at least anymore. Most of us are not in situations where we're wondering if the thing that's approaching us is a dog or a bear. We live in Los Angeles. And unless you're hiking up in Altadena, which I've seen a bear up there, this is not the type of fear response that we need in most situations. I ask the question again, what happens when we fear things that we don't need to? What happens when we react to things that we aren't even consciously aware of? What do we do? Cortisol is pumping, we've got the epinephrine going. What else? What happens? What do we actually do? Fight or run, or lock the door of your car, or cross the street, or avoid interacting or engaging with people. Yeah, this can absolutely come out in terms of fighting or running, and we see that in really high profile incidents of, police misconduct, etc. But this also results in us just avoiding people, and in some really basic ways. We're going to see some data later about what happens with doctors and patients. It can lead you to avoid asking patients questions that are relevant to their care. It can lead to you living a life where, because of racial anxiety, you just don't interact with entire groups of people unless you absolutely need to. Let's talk a little bit about the lived reality piece of this. Let's talk about how this plays out and the behaviors that this translates into. When we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about a specific form of bias.